Hello and welcome to iCampus, Liberia's first co-working and innovation space. Today we host the country's first learning conference to share knowledge around the idea of organizational learning and also to connect learning advocates across government and civil society organizations. This podcast is a fireside chat with Blair Glencorse of Accountability Lab Liberia and Dr. Tanya Garnett of Liberia's Strategic Analysis.
Non-profit organizations, civil society organizations, some private sector people, some people from LAVI, the USA project that's supporting this. And this morning we talked a lot about the challenges to learning. We tried to define what it is. And then just talked now about data collection and how to make sure we're collecting the right kinds of information. So over to you. What about a quick intro?
Okay, so my name is Dr. Tanya Garnett. As Blair mentioned, I work for Liberia Strategic Analysis, which is a 5-year monitoring, evaluation, and learning activity of USAID Liberia. And monitoring, evaluation, and learning, the learning, which is now what we call MEL, the L is kind of a new and evolving addition to monitoring evaluation, because typically we monitor and then we evaluate, but we don't always systematically try to learn from what we evaluate, and that really is the purpose of monitoring evaluation. So the L is kind of this new add-on to really emphasize that we should be learning from what we monitor and what we evaluate. And then that learning feeds into adaptation of program development. And so part of my title is Collaborating, Learning, and Adapting Advisor, and collaborating, learning, and adapting is also not really new to development, but it's becoming more emphasized. The fact that in order to have a successful development program, you have to be able to collaborate with stakeholders, you have to be able to learn with them, and then you have to be able to adapt your program accordingly. And without that aspect, it would be really difficult to have a strong development program. And so I got into monitoring evaluation through my development background. I have a PhD in international development. And monitoring evaluation is just an essential part of any development intervention, because you need to know what it is that you're trying to achieve, and you have to monitor whether you're able to achieve that. And the monitoring and evaluation and learning is part of that, making sure that you're having the impact that you want to have. So that's how I got into monitoring evaluation.
Excellent. So you touched on it there a little bit, but how do you, within the Liberian context, how do you define or understand organizational learning or adaptive learning?
I think as not just in the Liberian context, but generally, organizational learning is just making sure that you have a positive learning environment, making sure that any institution or organization that you're working in encourages learning. And that often starts with leadership. I think if leadership make the time and commitment for having a learning environment, that tends to translate throughout the work that people do. And by that I mean, having an environment where it's safe to ask questions. Having leadership that can admit that they don't know everything, right? Because no one knows everything. And it's really important, if you're having a positive learning environment, especially as a leader, to say, oh, I don't know everything, but we're learning. As human beings, we're learning. As professionals, we're always learning. And so in this environment, in this office or in this organization, we need to encourage each other to learn. It's always difficult when you have people in leadership positions who feel that they know everything and that they have nothing new to learn. And it reminds me of one of my professors who recently passed away. His name was Dr. Eamon Kelly. He was a well-respected educator and politician and economist in the US. And he used to say, oh, I'm not smart, I just keep smart people around me. In the sense that he really understood that he didn't have all the knowledge, but that didn't matter, because as long as he surrounded himself with people who knew things in their various sectors, that collectively you have a learning environment that can really accomplish things. And so I think that's part of what I consider a learning environment. And then I think when you learn, then what do you do? And the idea of having a learning environment is that you have to remain flexible and open to change, and flexible to adapting. So once you monitor and evaluate something and you learn something, then what? How do you then take that learning and apply it to what you're doing? If you realize that through your monitoring and your evaluation, there's an aspect of your program that isn't working, well, then you think about what that means, and then you adapt your programming or you adapt your approach to make sure that you're incorporating what you've learned into your actual practice. So I think that's what I think when I think about organizational learning.
So how is LSA seeing organizations in Liberia learn and use data effectively to improve what they do? Can you give us any examples of some of those?
From LSA's perspective, we work with the mission. It's an interesting development project because whereas most development projects work with beneficiaries in Liberia, either organizations or government entities, LSA's beneficiary is USAID. Because there was the recognition that even within development partners or within the donor community, there's a need to be more intentional about learning. And what we can see is that there's a greater interest in monitoring, evaluation, and learning. I think more than we've seen before. People really are interested in monitoring, they're interested in collecting data, they're interested in playing with data and understanding what that means. So at LSA, we're really into research, assessments, evaluations, data collection, and it's a very interesting and innovative project because we are basically demand-driven. We have a source of funds, and USAID Liberia decides what it is that they want to know, and they say, oh, we really need to know about this. What's going on in terms of cross-border trade? And then we just design a study, we get some experts, and we do that research. So it's really interesting being able to see what knowledge gaps there are and see how we can try to fill those knowledge gaps through our data collection activities. So I can see that there's this growing desire to learn and to know more and to use data more effectively. I think one thing that we're seeing too that needs to be stressed more is contextual understanding. And part of our work when we talk about knowledge management is not just the data that exists and the information that exists, but also kind of tapping into that information that doesn't exist, that's maybe not online. Every USAID activity has local team members, local experts. And I think we really need to remind people that the knowledge, the contextual understanding that those local experts have is really vital to the proper implementation of any activity. Because, if you're coming from another country into Liberia, your understanding is going to be limited. But when you have strong local team members that know that they're valued and that they have valuable knowledge to share, and they make those inputs, it can really lead to a strong program.
Absolutely. And I think you touched on one of the challenges to learning everywhere, which is understanding context and understanding how to get the information you need to improve. What other challenges do you see to learning in Liberia specifically, and do you have ideas for how we can begin to address those challenges?
I think one of the first things I would say is that people tend to be still data hoggers. Meaning that when you have information, you don't necessarily feel that that information belongs to everyone. People don't tend to share their information widely, and that's a challenge. For example, we did a GIS data collection. We also did data collection and information gathering for our knowledge management portal. And basically, we just hired some consultants to go around Liberia and get reports, data sets, articles, anything about Liberia. We just wanted a repository of information on Liberia's data so that researchers or people implementing a project who want to know more about something can actually have a source where they can just go to for free and get that information. Because oftentimes we feel that we're kind of reinventing the wheel. Especially as a consultant, before coming to LSA, I would go from one organization to another and see so many duplications. Oh, but IRC did this activity already. So why don't we learn from that and borrow from that and not have to redo what's already been done? And I think there's that lack of communication between various development partners, and they're often redoing the same thing and not really finding existing knowledge and building upon it. So I think that's one major challenge, which would be also a better use of resources, right? Because there's always more information and more knowledge gaps to fill. And so to not waste energy learning something that's already been done would be really useful. Some of the other challenges, I think because a lot of local organizations here are depending on donors, there's a lack of flexibility in the implementation of activities. And when we talk about having a learning environment and being open to learning from your context, from stakeholders, from your technical team, it means that you have to be open enough and willing to be flexible in your program design. And what often happens is you have a program design, let's say your donor says, oh, we want to implement this particular activity in adolescent girls or in whichever area, there's often a kind of predefined implementation plan. And oftentimes is not built into making sure that we can explore and adapt and change our activities based on the context or based on what we're learning. So I think that kind of donor-driven programming here restricts organizations from really being open learning environments. And so I think then finding alternate means of income that allow you to have more flexibility in how you program and how you plan and what activities you implement is really important. Also, I think there's a lack of intentional learning in a lot of programs here, because we can have good intentions about wanting to learn, but unless we intentionally program, for example, time, if you want to learn, you have to take time to do an assessment, you have to take time to talk to stakeholders, you have to take time to analyze the information you're getting from stakeholders and seeing how you can implement that into your activity. And then also, I don't think we really have the tools, some of the tools that we need. Something that we used to do at one of my organizations, we used to produce CD-ROMs of compressed libraries, entire libraries in a specific area. So let's say we're doing malaria. We would produce CDs of all of the latest research on malaria and put it on a disk and just share it widely. And so that people practicing in that area had excess amounts of information, and you didn't even need internet, because in some environments you may not have good internet, but having a disk, as long as you have a computer, you can access that information. But also online libraries are really useful. That's something that we use a lot during my graduate studies, and I use sometimes when I teach at the University of Liberia, is having a lot of online resources so that you're up to date on what's going on in the field, so that you know best practices and you can see how to apply that in relation to your practice, and what you're doing on the ground. It's always good to have a balance of theory and practice, because you can implement your activity on the ground, but it's really good to know what are other people doing in other countries, what's been proven to work, what has been proven not to work, so we don't even waste our time doing an activity that's never really worked anywhere. So I think those are some of the things that we could use to really be more intentional about learning.
Really interesting. In our small group earlier, we were talking about challenges, and one of the challenges that came up is not collecting the right data. So often there's lots of information, there's lots of data out there, but organizations aren't always good at understanding what data they need actually to learn. So for example, for this conference, we could do a survey afterwards and say, did you leave the conference happy or not? And people could say they're happy. And that would be data, but that wouldn't really help us understand whether they've actually learned anything in the conference. So how can organizations make sure that they're collecting the information that they need in order to learn?
I think when you collect data, you have to know what the purpose of that data is for. Are you collecting, because having too much data is not good. And we always say this, we think that collecting everything is really important, but then you just have a lot of data that you have to do something with, it, you have to analyze, that you have to filter, that you have to figure out. So it's a balancing act to get enough data, because once these people are gone, to get them back to do a survey will be difficult. So, you have to get enough data, but not too much data that it becomes overwhelming. And thinking about what the purpose is, what do I want to use this information for? So that when you ask questions, you're making sure to really answer the questions that you need to answer. So if the purpose is, I want to redesign and maybe adapt my planning of this conference for the next time, and I want to think about what activities I should do differently, what I should do the same, was there enough time? When you think about the purpose of the information that you're collecting, then I think you kind of work backwards and then say, okay, now how do I make sure that the questions I ask in my survey are going to get me the information that I need? So I think having a goal and a purpose in mind with what you want to do with this data, what are you using this data for, helps to kind of steer and guide you in terms of what questions to ask.
Are there other best practices from other parts of the world that you've seen in your work or your research that you think would be relevant and useful in Liberia for organizations that are thinking about learning?
You know, one thing that I did a lot in my graduate program, we had a distance-based learning program. And even in America in the early 2000s, that was something that was kind of revolutionary, that you could get your entire master's, you know, distance-based. And I think, of course, some of the challenges, you know, are the challenges that many other people will face in terms of internet connectivity, depending on where you are, rural connectivity. But we're actually seeing a lot of progress in Liberia in that way. And so I think we need to kind of take more advantage of distance-based learning courses, professional development courses, online libraries, like I was mentioning earlier. Something very simple like the dictionary. I tell my students all the time, I may speak the English language fairly well, but I still really rely on a dictionary and on a thesaurus. And these are key tools that you can get online and really integrate into the way that you write, you know, your documents, your emails, your reports. Another thing that I don't see us using very much is crowdsourcing. You know, I remember working on a project with Ushahidi. I don't know if anyone's heard of Ushahidi. But after the 2008 electoral violence in Kenya, Ushahidi was this software that, a crowdsourcing software that developed to collect geospatial information from people kind of in different locations. So it kind of combined citizen journalism with geospatial information and social media. And I know that Liberians are really into social media. Facebook is super popular here. And I think that we could try to use it social media for more instructive things, for more practical things, like accountability, or, you know, information sharing about key resources. How is the road in this area? Go this route, don't go that route. You know, this clinic is out of drugs, don't go to that one, go to this one. You know, there's so much benefit that could come from using that kind of simple existing software like crowdsourcing software that we don't really take advantage of.
So finally, and then if people have questions, you should feel free to ask them. What advice would you have, Tanya, for people here who are trying to get into learning, who are trying to use learning to improve what they do in their organizations? How can they get going? How can they get started on this?
A key tool is having a learning agenda. And I think we hear about that often, but it's very simple and it doesn't have to be complex. A learning agenda, the idea is just to have that intentional document that can be a living document that evolves and gets adapted, that, you know, in our organization we want to learn. And we want to learn, we need to learn just to be able to do what we do better, right? As you, in any organization or company, as you grow and as you develop, there are going to be challenges, and as you grow, that's a positive thing, right? Even in your personal life, as you grow, you're going to come across challenges, and those challenges have a lot of important lessons that we can learn. And so I think having a learning agenda is kind of setting an intentional practice of having research questions that we want to answer because we know that it's going to make us more effective, make our activity more useful, and also more efficient. And it can be really simple. It should always be collaborative, definitely. Get together with your team members, brainstorm. What is it that we want to know? What kind of research questions should we ask as an organization that would just help us do our work better? And I think one way of doing it is using the appreciative inquiry approach. I don't know if anybody's heard of that. Appreciative inquiry is an approach where instead of saying, oh, what's wrong, you know, and what's deficient or what's lacking from our organization, we take a more positive perspective and say, what is it that we want to do? What is it that we want to be? Where do we see ourselves in 5 years? And what are the key areas of gaps and knowledge gaps that exist that if we fill those knowledge gaps, we can better accomplish our objectives? And taking that perspective, and then once you've learned something, so you get your research questions for your learning agenda, you brainstorm up those research questions, let it be collaborative as much as possible. Then you answer those research questions through various means. Maybe you'll do a survey. Maybe one of those research questions, you want to do a focus group with some of your stakeholders or your beneficiaries. And then once you've learned something and you've answered those questions, you disseminate as much as possible, both internally within your team and then with other people outside of your team, especially key stakeholders that you interact with. You share that information. So I think it's a pretty easy process that could really help organizations be intentionally learning organizations.
And I think to add to that, here in Liberia, I think a great deal of respect goes to USAID for trying to support this kind of thinking and this kind of approach and these kinds of activities, which include, after this, a fail fair this evening, the idea of accepting failure as a learning process, the idea of understanding that it's okay to admit that things haven't gone to plan. That's not going to affect your funding. In fact, that should increase the resources that you get, because the learning that you are generating is not just useful for you and your organization, it's also useful for every other organization that is trying to do development in Liberia and trying to change social and political and economic dynamics here in positive ways. So I think from our perspective too, I think things are changing. The fact that all of you are here today is a sign that this is becoming more interesting, that there is a community emerging, and that for us is extremely encouraging, because you are the kind of people that we would like to partner with on learning. We would like to collaborate with around these kinds of issues, to take our collective knowledge and experience and ideas forward around these issues. So I think that it's great that we're having this conversation and that all of you are asking these kinds of questions, because it's really, really important. So thank you, Tanya, for that. Tanya is around. I'm sure she'd be happy to talk to you after this or subsequently about learning or what LSA is doing. So let's leave it there. Thank you so much, Tanya. Thank you.